Julian's first day at the digital content firm in Atlanta was quieter than expected. The office didn't hum with chatter or chaos the way he imagined a creative space might. Instead, it pulsed with precision. Everything was scheduled down to the minute. Cameras glided on tracks like silent sentinels. Meeting rooms glowed softly through frosted glass. It felt less like a startup and more like a production-ready set, always filming. Even if nothing was rolling. Julian adjusted his headphones, nodding as a senior tech explained the server sync protocols. But his eyes kept flicking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where a woman stood apart from the rest. Her heels didn't clack, they landed like exclamation points. Her bob-cut hair framed a face that had once commanded screens across the country. Tamara Quinn. Co-founder, former podcast host turned elusive head of creative strategy. She hadn't spoken during the morning brief, but when she moved, others shifted subtly to make space, as if her presence pressed against them. Julian had seen her before. Of course. Clips of her show floated online, sharp, funny, fearless, but in person, she carried a different weight. Less fire, more gravity, like a fallen star that chose where it landed. He returned to his desk and began setting up his workstation. Dual monitors, waveform software, color grading presets. This was his world. Audio was memory to him, vibration, resonance, a kind of intimacy he could sculpt. He didn't need lights, he needed silence and the exact breath between words. By the end of the second week, he was in a rhythm. Early in, late out, his edits were tight, his instincts clean. Then came the Monday content review meeting. Rick, the founder, leaned back in his chair, fingers locked over his chest. Gruff, efficient, eyes like surveillance cameras. They were reviewing a new podcast promo, one Julian had re-edited over the weekend. Instead of the usual two-camera wide, he'd built the piece around tight handheld close-ups, eyes, hands, smirks. It was intimate, risky, but it breathed. When the clip ended, silence lingered. Then Tamara spoke. Who cut this? Julian hesitated, unsure if he should claim it. A senior producer pointed his way. Tamara didn't nod, she just studied him, long enough for others to glance between them. It feels lived in, she said finally. We need more of that. The meeting moved on, but Julian didn't. The rest of the day blurred, his ears replaying her phrase. That night, as he organized drive folders, a Slack ping appeared. Tamara Q. Mind staying a few minutes after hours? Want to get your thoughts on an old storyboard? Nothing urgent, just curious. He stared at the message. It was innocuous, professional, but something about the just curious made him pause. She was waiting in the editing suite. Lights low, wall screens glowing. She handed him a tablet, an unreleased campaign storyboard from years ago. He scanned the panels. Tamara sat beside him, a little closer than protocol required. This one never made it out. Rick thought it was too introspective, she said, air quoting the last word. Julian tapped a panel. The framing here, it's ahead of its time. She smiled. You see it, that's rare. There it was again, those eyes. Deep, searching, not flirtatious, but open, like she was peeling back a page of herself to see if he'd flinch. They talked for 40 minutes. Not about office politics, about story, voice, rhythm. At one point, she said, the lens doesn't lie, but it edits. Remember that. Julian left that night with a strange charge in his chest, not adrenaline. Not pride, something quieter, like being noticed for the first time in years. Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. She'd invite him to look at old content, ask his take on framing choices, compliment his use of sound layering, always under the pretense of work, always within the lines, barely. She called him, the kid with clean cuts. He didn't mind. Her voice was velvet laced with challenge, and her presence, so curated, so practiced, felt like a performance just for him. Julian began editing longer hours. Not because he had to. Because he hoped she'd walk in. Even when she didn't, he stayed. He stopped talking about work with his roommates. He stopped checking his dating apps. He started thinking about color temperature more than meals. One Friday evening, as they watched a rough cut together, Tamara leaned in and asked, "Do you think editors are just failed directors who learned to hide their vision behind other people's?" Julian answered without thinking, "No, I think they're surgeons. We cut to keep the story alive." She stared at him, not the way a boss looks at an employee. The way someone scans a painting they forgot they ever painted. When he left that night, the parking lot was empty. The air was thick, summer storm on the edge. He looked back once. Her office light was still on. As he drove home, his heart beat faster than it should have. And in the blur of taillights and rain starting to fall, he whispered to himself, "I thought she wanted my ideas. She really wanted the man who still believed in them." He didn't know it yet, but the story had already begun. And the camera, somewhere, was already rolling. The hours at the studio blurred into one another, late nights laced with coffee. The static hum of editing bays. And the occasional distant thud of a prop falling in the equipment room. It wasn't unusual for Julian to stay behind after hours, especially with deadlines mounting, but what changed wasn't the work. It was her presence. It started with the messages. They weren't overtly flirtatious at first. Tamara would send him clips with playful critiques. "Your transitions are smoother than Rick's apologies," she once joked. Another time, she sent an old behind-the-scenes photo from a shoot 10 years ago, her in a leather jacket, holding a boom mic and laughing mid-sentence. "Back when I thought I had to yell to be heard," she captioned. Julian replied with laughter, emojis, and the kind of reverence only a newcomer to the industry could still offer. His admiration was sincere, untainted by cynicism. Then came the voice note. It arrived at 1:42 a.m., wrapped in the quiet loneliness of the studio. He was adjusting levels on a trailer when he saw the alert, a 17-second voice message. "You're the first one who ever cut my breath the way I cut scripts." He replayed it 3 times. There was no background noise. Just her voice, husky, deliberate, and trembling at the edges, like a tightrope stretched just past its limits. The next day, she said nothing about it. Nor did he. 2 nights later, they were the last ones left in the editing suite. The team had gone home after finalizing the campaign's hero cut. But Tamara had asked Julian to stay and review a different version she was toying with. The lights were dimmed to save power. The screen cast a cool blue glow that danced across her cheekbones as she leaned forward, tracing the arc of a cut with her finger. Julian leaned in too, his eyes on the footage, until he felt it, her hand, light, hesitant, pressing against the small of his back. He didn't move, and when he turned to her, she didn't smile, she just looked. The kiss was sudden but not rushed. Neither of them gasped. It was slow, deliberate, like pulling an old reel from the archive and threading it through a machine-long idle. There was no whisper of names, no desperate undressing, only hands, quiet, curious, undeniable. They left the suite hand in hand, the silence between them humming louder than the overhead buzz. The design studio was dark but unlocked. They slipped inside, past faux marble pillars and green screen curtains. Between crates of lighting gels and boxes of audio rigs, they found space, on a velvet staging couch used in interviews. She took control, not with force, but with certainty, as if she had done this before, many times, with many versions of the same young man. Julian didn't ask, he just followed. Later, he lay on the couch, heart racing, while Tamara ran her fingers across the stitches in the fabric. Saying nothing, she dressed slowly, pulling on her shirt as if easing out of a costume. When she finally looked at him, it was with a glint of something unreadable. Not regret, not affection, something in between. "Don't ask what this is," she said, "just let it be the reel that runs before the movie." Julian tried to laugh. He didn't succeed. The next morning, walking into the studio felt different. He wasn't an intern anymore. Not just a technician. He was something else, something undefined. Something that came with privilege. Or consequences. His fingers hesitated over the playback button on his console. For the first time in months, he questioned whether what he was building was a career, or a trap. But the messages kept coming. Shorter now, more ambiguous. Photos of empty chairs, her voice singing one line of a jazz standard. Random quotes from old noir films. Julian felt chosen. But somewhere, just out of frame, a lens had already started recording. He just didn't know it yet. We pressed record, but I didn't know she was the one filming. The first time Tamara asked Julian to meet her at the studio loft. It sounded almost casual. It's where we archive old tapes and audio reels. A bit dusty, but perfect when you want silence that doesn't feel empty. Julian arrived with a hard drive and a notebook, expecting to digitize old files. Instead, he walked into a space that felt lived in, not dusty, but curated. Velvet blackout curtains, polished walnut desks, a minibar in the corner. The lights dimmed amber, like a scene meant for a late-night monologue. The faint hum of an old amplifier buzzed in the air. Tamara was barefoot, curled on a low couch with her laptop balanced on one thigh. "Come in, just working on the sizzle reel." That was the beginning. They started meeting there weekly, then twice a week. The place became their sanctuary from the corporate timelines, from Rick's looming presence, from the critical gaze of production meetings. They told themselves it was work. Always work. Tamara brought over a gift the second week. A top-of-the-line Loupedeck console. "You deserve tools that respond to your instincts." Julian was stunned. "This costs more than my rent." She smiled. "Consider it an investment in what you're becoming." It was followed by a camera gimbal, then a custom monitor, and finally, a proposal. When her private podcast network launched, he would be executive editor. Julian, once skeptical of flattery, started to believe it. No one had ever spoken of his potential so unapologetically. Until the red light blinked. One evening, while adjusting color grading on a side monitor, Julian noticed it, a faint red glow above the main camera in the corner. It was subtle, almost hidden behind a potted plant. He pointed at it. "Is that recording?" Tamara turned, squinting, then laughed. Too quickly. "Oh God, I probably left it on after a voice test. You know how many reels I leave running." He smiled weakly, but something in his spine tightened. Another week, he saw something stranger. Tamara was editing a trailer for a mockumentary pitch. On the preview monitor, for just a second, Julian saw a freeze frame, his back, shirtless, in the studio. He didn't speak, just waited. She noticed. "This is a world where people steal stories." "Julian," she said calmly, "I just document mine before anyone else can rewrite them." He wanted to believe her, desperately, but that night, as he watched her mouth shape his name in an old recording, he wondered whether this was preservation, or control. Around the office, whispers started, not loud, but sharp. "She's grooming him. Another intern bitten by the queen. Wait till Rick finds out." Julian confronted none of it. But during a late shift, an old sound engineer paused beside his desk. "Be careful," the man said, voice low. "You're not the first who thought he mattered." Julian barely blinked. What happened to the last one? The engineer's mouth pressed into a grim line. "He was brilliant. Now he writes captions for ASMR mukbangs." The walls of the studio, once a haven, began to sweat. Every cable, every lens, every static buzz now seemed to hum a quiet warning. Julian started checking the ceiling corners before undressing. He stopped keeping mementos. Deleted voice notes she sent at 2 a.m. avoided eye contact during team reviews. But the hardest thing wasn't mistrust. It was mourning. Because somewhere between Tamara's late-night calls and the morning lattes with his name spelled right, Julian had believed they were building something real, intimate. Now he wondered if that belief was the exact thing Tamara had needed from him. He stopped asking when the network would launch. She stopped mentioning it. She'd walk past him in the hallway now with a grin that meant nothing, or everything. He couldn't tell anymore. He walked into the studio one last time, hoping to catch her alone. To ask, what, exactly? Instead, he saw her adjusting her camera. Alone, framed perfectly in a mirror. And in that stillness, it hit him. Maybe he wasn't in her story. He was just the footage. The lockout happened on a Tuesday morning. Julian arrived early, latte in hand, ready to finalize a sequence Tamara had marked as urgent the night before. But when he entered his login credentials, the access terminal returned a sterile message. Access denied. Please contact your administrator. At first, he thought it was a tech glitch. Server downtime wasn't unusual, but when his ID badge failed to buzz him through the second-floor editor's suite, his stomach sank. A security guard appeared within minutes. Polite but firm. "Mr. Fields, I've been instructed to escort you to our." The walk felt longer than it should have. Every framed campaign along the corridor, clips he helped sharpen, soundbites he mastered, seemed to judge him. The air conditioning was unusually cold. At the end of the hallway sat Maria from our, flanked by two others, both unfamiliar. "Julian," Maria began, her voice not unkind, but measured, clinical, "your access has been suspended. Pending an internal investigation." Investigation into what? She didn't answer. Instead, she slid a screen across the table and pressed play. It was the studio. The timestamp was from 2 weeks ago. The angle came from one of the ceiling cams, static, but all-seeing. It showed Julian and Tamara. The moment their bodies met. The moment her hand pulled him in. The moment he kissed her like it meant the beginning of something. There was no sound, until it cut to a second feed. This one had audio, muffled but unmistakable. Her size, his voice, her name. Julian turned away. "This was recorded without my consent," he said, voice brittle. "We're not here to debate legality," Maria said. "We're here to understand how it ended up synced to the company's training archive." He blinked. "What?" She nodded toward the second screen. A screen where the file name ended in softskills_module3_final. He couldn't speak. He barely remembered leaving the room. Everything became blur. Faces too still. Steps too loud. Eyes that didn't want to meet his. Later that afternoon, the company gathered in the small screening room for what was presented as an emergency cultural reset meeting. Tamara took the stage. She was immaculate. A neutral-toned suit, soft makeup, hair pinned back. Her voice, when it came, was a masterclass in balance, measured sorrow, quiet strength. "I want to acknowledge a personal lapse," she said, "a breach in judgment that has affected our shared space." Julian sat at the back. No one asked him to leave. No one acknowledged he was even there. There was an imbalance of power. Tamara continued, "I was in a vulnerable place emotionally. Certain advances were made, and I lacked the clarity to stop them." She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She didn't mention his name. Only when someone asked, a meek voice from the crowd, did she glance at the back of the room and say. He manipulated the dynamic. Julian's ears rang. He felt both burning and hollow. Rick came in as the meeting broke. He didn't walk over to Tamara. He didn't look at Julian. He merely paused by the door and said, "Just loud enough. We know what to do with broken data." By evening, Julian's inbox was inaccessible, his profile scrubbed from the company site. The footage, though supposedly secured, had already started circulating in private Discord groups and Slack threads. By morning, memes were being made. Someone replaced his LinkedIn headshot with a still frame from the video. A new nickname followed, Camera Boy. Job leads dried up. Recruiters stopped replying. Friends from the industry ghosted. Even those who had envied his rise now seemed oddly satisfied. Tamara released a Medium post, vague, poetic, self-reflective. It was shared widely, applauded. Julian read it alone, in a diner near the bus station, where no one knew his name. She filmed the pleasure, he took the blame, and the world clapped for her narrative. The house in Savannah was old, creaking, and wrapped in ivy. It belonged to Mason, an old college friend who now lived a quiet life restoring vintage bicycles and brewing his own beer. When Julian showed up at his door with a duffel bag and a silence that weighed more than words, Mason only nodded, stepped aside, and said, Guest rooms clean, no questions. Julian didn't say much for the first week. He woke early, ran long, came back drenched in sweat and regret, and buried himself in wedding footage. He had taken a freelance gig from a small bridal videography agency, editing memories he hadn't lived, shaping joy from someone else's vows. It paid enough for food, for rent, for staying invisible. The room he worked in was dim, curtains always drawn, monitors casting soft flickers against his unshaven jaw. Some days he'd catch himself adjusting a frame, freezing on a bride's smile, then closing the window as if her joy was too loud. He didn't speak about Atlanta. He didn't mention Tamara, but in every paused frame, every slow dissolve, a shadow of her lingered. One afternoon, a young production assistant from the agency, Natalie, stopped by. She was bubbly, curious, 22 and still believed in the romance of cameras. She handed him a thumb drive and said, "Old footage, just make it flow." When she came back 3 days later to pick up the edit, she leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching his screen. "You're good," she said, quietly, "like, really good. The way you framed that kiss in the mirror. That's not just editing, that's performance. You ever think about going back to big work?" Julian didn't turn. He clicked save, then quit the software. "Some stories look better from far away," he said. She lingered a second longer, maybe waiting for something deeper. But when none came, she smiled, took the drive, and left. That night, Julian sat alone with his laptop. The cursor blinked in a blank email window addressed to himself. No subject line. He began to type. "I thought we created something. But she only created proof. I thought we built a reel of us, fragments of feeling. Montage of nights that meant something. But maybe I was the B-roll. Maybe I was the placeholder until the next draft came along." He stared at it for a long time, then added one more line. "You weren't her equal, you were her edit." He never clicked send. The weeks turned into months. Julian stopped dreaming about microphones and dolly tracks. His hands grew steadier, not on gimbals, but on wood, on splices of ribbon, on timelines that didn't need rewinding. He learned to live with soft focus. Sometimes, walking downtown, he'd see a poster of a podcast festival with Tamara's name still attached as a creative consultant. Her face smiled from glossy banners like nothing had broken, like she had kept every cut, every version of herself, perfectly stitched. He never tore them down. Instead, he went home, opened a fresh project, and trimmed a father-daughter dance to the swell of a piano. He watched their arms wrap around each other, the way forgiveness lived in silence. And in that silence, something loosened inside him. No revenge, no press, just the echo of something once lit, now folded into the dark. The final line he wrote, on a sticky note, stuck to the edge of his monitor. "She had a camera, I had a dream, only one of us kept the edit." And then he turned off the lights, and let it fade to black.